Welcome to our viewers on public television in America and also around the globe. The White House has condemned the suicide attack on a hospital in the Pakistani city of Quetta. At least 70 people were killed and more than 100 injured in the blast. Many of the victims were lawyers and journalists who'd gathered to mourn the fatal shooting of a senior lawyer. There have been conflicting reports on who's to blame for the attack, with both a faction of the Pakistani Taliban and so-called Islamic State claiming credit. Shaima Halil reports.
Ambulances rushing to the site of an explosion. The target, Quetta's main hospital. Many lawyers were among the dead and injured. They'd come to mourn a colleague, a prominent advocate and the head of the Bar Association, who was gunned down earlier in the day. They stood outside the emergency ward to protest his killing before they themselves became victims of a blast. There were scenes of carnage and chaos as emergency services rushed to move the injured to safety. The local bomb disposal squad says that at least 8 kilos of explosives were used. The police suspect a suicide bombing. Inside the hospital, people scrambled for safety amid utter fear and confusion. Outside, some were overwhelmed by the violence that hit them. Police have surrounded the hospital and cordoned off the area. An investigation is now underway to find out how an attack on this scale hit the heart of the main hospital of the provincial capital. Quetta has seen many attacks in the past, and lawyers have been targeted in recent weeks. But this blast marks a new level of violence against advocates in Pakistan's restive province of Baluchistan. The province's chief minister said this was a security lapse and was quick to blame Pakistan's regional rival, India. Lawyers across the country have denounced the bombing and announced a countrywide one-day strike and a week of mourning. Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Islamabad.
For more on this attack, I was joined a short time ago by Hussein Haqqani, Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States. So lawyers in Pakistan say this is an attack on justice itself. What's your reaction to the bombing in Quetta?
The extremist jihadis obviously do not appreciate or agree with modernity, and lawyers do represent rule of law. They represent a more secular orientation than the jihadis would want. Pakistan's dilemma is that it ends up supporting certain jihadis for operations against Afghanistan and India, while at the same time opposing others. The ones it supports end up helping the ones it opposes.
Well, here we have two separate groups who've claimed responsibility for this attack, a faction of the Pakistani Taliban and Islamic State. Just tell us more about Baluchistan and all the militant groups that operate there.
Well, there are 42 jihadi extremist groups in Pakistan that have been identified as perpetrators of terrorism in Pakistan. Several have been banned but have resurfaced because of Pakistan's policy of making a distinction between groups that it can use against its neighbors and groups that it wants to suppress. Baluchistan is a particularly difficult province. It has an insurgency going on by Baluch secular nationalists, and the army tends to use the Islamists to try and fight the separatists or nationalists whom it considers to be a greater threat to Pakistan.
So it's very complicated, but Pakistan's Prime Minister had announced a crackdown on extremist groups. Was it having some success before this?
There was success, but the success will always be limited by Pakistan's own 25-year policy of making distinctions between groups. So while some groups have been suppressed, others have not. And each group then ends up splintering because of some doctrinal or other difference, which is why you have various groups claiming a responsibility and various groups operating in Baluchistan and elsewhere.
But has that policy that you're talking about created a monster now for the Pakistani state with so many militant groups?
It has indeed created a monster, and Pakistan's people have suffered because of that. But Pakistan's military intelligence service, Pakistan's military, and some elements of what can be called the Pakistani establishment are just too wedded to this policy to want to change it, even though the cost is as high as we saw today.
Well, Washington is a major supporter of Pakistan. Is there any more pressure or more support that could be brought to bear there?
It's quite clear that Washington's support, $23 billion since 9/11, has not worked sufficiently to make Pakistan change its policy entirely. And so we do not know what pressure Washington might be able to bear. I think what we have to live with is that Pakistan will continue to be in this dichotomous position until and unless Pakistan's leaders realize that the price their people are paying is just too high.
And is there any sign at all of any peace talks that might lead to something between Pakistan and Afghanistan and that porous border that the militants go across?
The talks between Pakistan and Afghanistan have not borne fruit for the simple reason that Pakistan's ambitions in Afghanistan are very disproportionate to Pakistan's abilities in the region. And Pakistan always sees Afghanistan through the eyes of its conflict with India. So it's always loath to allow Afghanistan having any relationship with India, and Pakistan continues to look upon them with suspicion. The more Pakistan supports groups like the Taliban, the more the Afghans suspect Pakistan.
Ambassador Haqqani, thank you so much for joining us.